Day here in the Senate. Committee passed 3 to 3. Madam President.
The senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Madam President. After months of delay, the NDAA has finally made its way to the Senate floor. The Senate Armed Services Committee passed its version by a strong bipartisan vote of 23 to 3, and that was back in July. As a member of the Armed Services Committee since my first day here in the Senate, I've been proud to help draft this bill each year since 2013, and I was honored to play a part in drafting the bill this year. First and foremost, the 2022 NDAA takes care of the greatest asset America has, our men and women in uniform. It supports a well-deserved pay raise for members of the military, and it reauthorizes important special pays and bonuses. Keeping faith with our all-volunteer forces is essential so that our military men and women are able to focus on combating the threats that our nation faces abroad. You don't have to look far to see the threats that I'm talking about. Vladimir Putin has placed nearly 100,000 Russian troops right on Russia's border with Ukraine, essentially posturing to invade a sovereign country. China continues to make shocking progress in developing new types of weapons. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that China's recent test of a fractional orbital bombardment system was very close to, quote, a Sputnik moment. This new missile could potentially carry a nuclear warhead anywhere in the world, and it was specifically designed to evade United States defenses. Our adversaries are making huge strides forward. The NDAA recognizes that and addresses it. This bill will keep the modernization of our strategic nuclear deterrent on schedule. This is crucial because even though our nuclear forces are still effective, we have pushed our weapons far beyond their designed lifetimes, in some cases by decades. This bill authorizes the resources necessary to keep modernization on track, and it will help make sure the next generation of systems is available before our current nuclear triad ages out. Perhaps most importantly, the NDAA tries to keep defense spending on pace with rising inflation. Inflation is at its highest level in decades, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. The Biden administration originally proposed a top-line defense spending increase of just 1.6%. That would not have kept pace with inflation even in a normal year. But in a year when it is threatening to spiral out of control, it would have meant an unacceptable cut in resources for our military. The NDAA takes this year's runaway inflation into account. It offers an increase of $25 billion on top of President Biden's proposal, and we came together across party lines to agree to that because it is what our military needs. At the risk of stating the obvious, the NDAA is about investing in our national defense. It's in the name, the National Defense Authorization Act. But every state contributes in its own way to that national goal. And I'm proud to say that this bill will bring some major wins to Nebraska, which has a long and rich military history. It includes $100 million for the National Disaster Recovery Fund, which will help rebuild Offutt Air Force Base, the home of the Air Force's 55th Wing, and U.S. Strategic Command after the devastating flooding that Nebraska experienced in 2019. And it recognizes how critical the 55th Wing is to our nation's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. Their missions take them all over the world, but they are proudly based in my state of Nebraska. Madam President, the men and women who wear American military uniforms are part of the best fighting force the world has ever known. Our job here in Congress is to give them what they need, and this year's NDAA does just that. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. It's the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Alive or dead. 1993. Madam President,
Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, in her 1993 Nobel lecture, Toni Morrison, no conservative, told the story of an old woman who was approached by a group of kids, mocking her and asking her to offer her conjecture. Quote, "Old woman, I hold in my hand a bird. Tell me whether it's living or dead." The blind old woman was revered for her wisdom and experience. She responded, "I don't know whether the bird you're holding is dead or alive. But what I do know is that it's in your hands. It is in your hands." The old woman, of course, meant whether the bird is alive or dead is the responsibility of the person who holds it. Morrison said the blind woman shifts attention away from assertions of power to the instrument through which that power is exercised. Now, Morrison could have been talking about Congress. Now, I'll leave to your judgment who in Congress is a mocking youth and who is the old woman. But in politics, it is the instrument of power rather than the assertion of power that matters. Just this last week, the instruments of power were used, despite assertions otherwise, to quietly pave the way for the Democrats' Destroy America bill, which they've called Build Back Better. Congress used a novel procedure to pass a bill giving Democrats a blank check to raise the debt ceiling to pay for Build Back Better. Procedural jiu-jitsu is hardly the stuff of base-motivating campaign rhetoric, but it is the instrument of power. Now, I'll describe how this happened, but a bit of background is necessary. Like most legislation in the Senate, raising the debt ceiling, which has been done now 99 times since the end of the Second World War, ordinarily requires 60 votes, which in an evenly divided Senate means Democrats and Republicans have to work together to find an acceptable outcome. There is, of course, an exception that would allow Democrats to use a special budget reconciliation procedure to raise the debt ceiling without Republican help, with a simple majority vote. A simple majority vote that they could achieve if all 50 Democrats cast their vote and there's an evenly divided vote at the end of the day that can be broken by the Vice President. But they didn't want to use this special procedure. And I believe they didn't want to use it for two independent reasons. First, it was inconvenient. The special reconciliation procedure would require too many steps and too much time for their taste. Still, I don't know of a single Republican senator, myself included, who would unduly stall the Democrats from proceeding to its consideration. In fact, under the rules, if they follow the right steps, it's more or less a guaranteed outcome, one that doesn't require a supermajority, and at the end of the day can be accomplished with a simple majority. Second, I suspect that Democrats didn't want to bear the political cost of raising the debt ceiling without some Republican cover. This would ordinarily mean using the standard 60-vote process, but that's not how it happened. Instead of Democrats and Republicans working together to find consensus on the appropriate way to raise the debt ceiling, likely in exchange for spending reforms, some combination of Senate and House leadership concocted a new mechanism. On a 60-vote bill, Republicans agreed to let Democrats pass an entirely separate bill to raise the debt ceiling without any Republican votes by whatever amount they want. So rather than negotiating a reasonable number, Republicans agreed to ensure that the debt ceiling is increased by as many trillions of dollars as the Democrats might need to fulfill their agenda. There's an actual blank space in the bill where Democrats can write in whatever number they want. In exchange, Republicans would be protected from scrutiny for insisting that Democrats follow the established rules for raising the debt ceiling through the reconciliation procedure, and would be able to launder this vote to appear as something other than helping Democrats raise the debt ceiling, which they had publicly committed, in writing no less, not to do. Now, to make matters worse, congressional leadership tied this to a bill preventing automatic Medicare cuts. This sent a clear message: give Democrats a blank check, or there would be Medicare cuts. Some of my Republican colleagues couldn't allow them to shoot that hostage being held captive by Democrats. The playbook is written. The idea that this is a one-time thing or somehow similar to other expedited procedures, for example, those found under the Congressional Review Act, to disapprove of executive agency rules, is preposterous. The comparison doesn't work. These are very different creatures. I'm sure this vicious tactic, the one used here, has not seen its last use, far from it. I'm certain it'll be used in the future to enact other progressive agenda items, including many that are simply unable to garner the 60 votes necessary under the normal and transparent Senate filibuster rules. With a blank check and a new special procedure, Democrats are able to raise the debt ceiling by whatever amount they deem necessary to accommodate their Destroy America bill, which they call Build Back Better. They've set that price, and we know this now as of just the last few hours, at $2.5 trillion. This is the behemoth bill that would seek to grant a form of amnesty to illegal aliens, to further the Green New Deal agenda, overturn state right-to-work laws, increase vaccine mandate fines on private employers to $700,000, infuse critical race theory indoctrination into medical care, and grow the IRS by 87,000 agents. And that, Madam President, isn't even the tip of the iceberg. The blank check to remake America was a gift to progressives from those within the Republican Party who decided to grant it. I regret deeply their decision to do so. And the filibuster, the major instrument of power, preserving the unique identity of the United States Senate, was all it cost. As to who was the old woman and who were the mocking children from Toni Morrison's story, I can't say, but America is the bird. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Is being felt across our upper army during the past.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, on Friday, the Department of Labor reported that inflation had hit a near 40-year high, confirming what many American families have been feeling in their wallets for many months. The soaring cost of virtually everything from gasoline to groceries is a growing crisis that affects families across our nation. The numbers are alarming. During the past year, the Consumer Price Index, which measures the price of goods and services, jumped by nearly 7%. That's the highest rate since 1982. It represents the sixth consecutive month of inflation exceeding 5%. The goods experiencing the greatest increases read like a list of everyday essentials. Energy costs are up by 33%. Used vehicles are up by 31%. Hamburger costs more by 14%. Milk, eggs, baby food, furniture, and many other necessities all cost more. And those prices are simply unsustainable for many working families. The pain is being felt across the nation, including in my state of Maine. I have heard from many Mainers worried about how they will be able to afford to heat their homes this winter. The average price of heating oil in Maine is currently $3.15 per gallon, compared to $2.11 per gallon this time last year. While the amount of heating oil a household uses varies considerably, a typical Maine family will spend nearly $1,000 more this year on home heating oil. The state of Maine is disproportionately affected by this rise in costs, since more than 60% of our homes use fuel oil as their primary energy source for heating, compared to only 4% of households nationally. Madam President, the rise in the price of heating oil is not the only hardship that Mainers are facing this winter. Mainers have shared with me their genuine concerns about being able to afford to drive back and forth to work and to put nutritious food on the table. Gas prices in Maine are about $1.30 per gallon higher than last year. Business owners face the often impossible challenge of paying higher prices for commodities, food, and supplies without passing those increases on to their already struggling consumers. For example, Maine restaurant owners who have already experienced an extraordinarily difficult 18 months due to the pandemic are now grappling with double-digit percentage increases in the cost of ingredients and other goods needed to run their businesses. An owner of a restaurant I visited in Searsport told me that the cost of fryer grease has skyrocketed from $19 to $48 per case. Another restaurant owner in Rockland recently told the Bangor Daily News that the price for prime ribs has more than doubled from $7 to $17. These supply costs shrink their already slim margins and exacerbate other difficulties the industry is facing with staffing shortages and pandemic-related closures. After a tough 2020 caused by COVID-related market disruptions and drought, Maine's resilient potato growers rebounded with yields up 20% over last year. Such a strong harvest usually would be cause for celebration, but farmers are facing rising transportation, fuel, and fertilizer costs that are hurting their bottom line and forcing them to pass on some of the inflationary costs to their customers. The increased costs of doing business means that families and processors will pay more for potatoes and growers will get a lower return on their crop. Madam President, this weekend, the Wall Street Journal reported on how inflation is harming the employees at the One Stop Tulsa gas station in Aroostook County in northern Maine. One clerk was working 60 hours each week, up from 40 before the pandemic, because they are so short-staffed. Even with the increased hours, she said she is struggling with rising costs from food to electricity. Melissa Holmes, the gas station manager, said that her twice-monthly grocery bill has increased from $300 to $500, and it now costs her $60 to fill up her 2011 Ford Explorer. That is $20 more than last year. Ms. Holmes also described facing customers who are frustrated by the higher prices. The cost of chicken, for example, has gone up, so an order of chicken tenders has jumped from $5.49 to $8.99. That's a big increase, and customers are feeling that squeeze. After passage of the President's $1.9 trillion stimulus this spring, the price of goods and services went up. We heard reassurances from the President's team that this inflation was transitory, but no acknowledgement of the role that their policies have had on soaring prices. Americans are feeling the consequences as Washington has overheated the economy. We in Congress must confront this inflation crisis, but instead, the Biden administration is pushing trillions in additional macroeconomic stimulus in the President's Build Back Better plan. The consequences for an already overheated economy could be devastating. Given the clear link between recent extraordinary government spending and rampant inflation, we should not be adding more fuel to the fire. Our economy is ailing, so it would be wise to begin to follow the maxim that guides medical professionals. First, do no harm. Democrats have said that their spending spree, which follows the Build Back Better plan, would cost $1.7 trillion. Several of the proposals in that plan would be set to expire after 1, 3, or 5 years, a gimmick that hides the true cost, because we know that is not what the real hope is, nor what is going to happen. Last week, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projected that making the social spending programs in the Build Back Better plan permanent would, in fact, cost $4.9 trillion over the decade. $4.9 trillion. Doing so would add $3 trillion to the deficit, unless paid for with even more taxes beyond those that the Democrats have already proposed in their bill. That's much higher than the purported $1.7 trillion price tag, because we know that the ultimate goal is to make these expensive programs permanent. Madam President, inflation is a regressive tax. It does not discriminate among the rich and the poor. It does not take into account the ability to pay. It is a cruel tax, one that punishes thrift by diminishing the value of savings. This is damaging to families that are saving to buy a home or for their children's education. It can be devastating to our seniors who can do nothing but helplessly watch as the retirement funds that they worked for their whole lives don't go nearly as far as they had expected. Like the pandemic itself, we do not know for certain whether this inflation crisis will abate, be prolonged, or even accelerate. Our immediate focus should be on measures that we know will have a lasting and beneficial impact on our economy, such as implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law, opening up and repairing our supply chains, getting more Americans back to work, and protecting the earnings of hardworking Americans. What we should not do is pass trillions of dollars in additional spending in the administration's Build Back Better bill that would exacerbate the toll that inflation imposes on seniors, working families, and small businesses. We should not take that risk. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam President.
There's a quorum call.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you so much, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today after a long week of wrestling with my conscience. Before we left Washington last week, we in this chamber made a change in the Senate's rules in order to push forward something that all of us think is important. We set the stage to raise the nation's debt ceiling. And yet, as we cast that vote to begin addressing the debt ceiling, this same chamber is allowing the ceiling of our democracy to crash in around us. The American people have been pushing for leaders in Washington to address voting rights. And everywhere I turn, I have been hearing from my constituents in Georgia. They are deeply worried. I heard it all weekend. I've been hearing it over the last several months. And I submit that they are worried for good reason. They know their history. They are witnessing what is happening to our democracy in real time. And they see the handwriting on the wall. They see the sweeping voter suppression proposals in 49 states and the dozens of new laws that have now popped up across the nation, fueled by the big lie that seeks to delegitimize the voices of millions of Georgians and Americans who made their voices heard, made history, and more importantly, made a difference last November and last January. The American people see what is happening in Arizona and in Texas and in Florida and in Wisconsin and in Iowa. And they see what is happening in Georgia, my home state, where a new law, SB 202, passed right after I won, will make it harder for some voters to access their ballots by making it more difficult to vote by mail, allowing far fewer drop boxes, and only allowing for the use of those boxes, listen, during business hours. You can use the drop boxes during business hours, which sort of defeats the purpose of having a drop box. In fact, back home, the second most senior Republican in the Georgia State Senate announced recently that he wants to do away with election drop boxes altogether, literal boxes where registered eligible voters simply can drop off their ballots on their way to the night shift or on their way back home. It seems to me that they want fewer voters and more dark money in our elections. And that's the sad place we're in, Madam President, right now. But what is even more disconcerting is that these politicians in the state legislature have already laid the tracks to take over local boards of elections for almost any frivolous reason, to undermine the voices of local voters and local election administrators, control the count, muddy the waters, question or determine the outcome. And in the face of this crisis, the question is this: has this chamber risen to the occasion to take on the issue of voting rights which I submit is the central moral issue confronting this Congress in this moment. What have we done to strengthen access to the ballot as bedrock voting rights protections have been shredded by our courts, or to protect the sacred right to vote as partisan state legislatures have passed laws to dilute that right for so many people? Well, some of us have acted. Democrats in this body have tried, not once, not twice, but we've tried this Congress on 3 occasions to consider legislation to protect and expand voting rights so that more eligible Americans can make their voices heard and help shape the direction of our country. And each time, whether it was for the People Act, or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or the Freedom to Vote Act, with just one lone exception, all of our friends across the aisle have refused to engage with us in any way to address the growing barriers to what is basic to American democracy, the ballot box. And here's what we've said. We've said to our Republican friends, if you don't like this provision or that provision, let's talk about it. Offer some amendments. Come, let us reason together. Let us have a debate out in the open so that the American people can hear it. Everybody talks about the divisions in America right now. Here is what folks on the left and the right agree on. There is something awry in our democracy, and in this moment in which there is this debate happening on the outside, how is it that we refuse to even have a debate in the Senate? They don't even want to have a debate. And so here we are. Months have passed. No, that's not true. Years have passed. Democrats have tried again and again to engage our Republican friends in a discussion on this issue, one that lies at the foundation of our democracy, and time again, because of a lack of good faith engagement, the rules of the Senate have prevented us from moving that conversation forward. We could not imagine changing the rules. That is, until last week. Because last week, we did exactly that. Be very clear, last week, we changed the rules of the Senate to address another important issue, the economy. This is a step, a change in the Senate rules we haven't been willing to take to save our broken democracy, but one that a bipartisan majority of this chamber thought was necessary in order to keep our economy strong. We changed the rules to protect the full faith and credit of the United States government. We've decided we must do it for the economy, but not for the democracy. So, Madam President, I will be honest. This has been a difficult week for me as I've pondered how am I going to vote on this debt ceiling question we're about to take. I feel like I'm being asked to take a road that is a point of moral dissonance for me. Because while I deeply believe that both our democracy and our economy are important, I believe that it is misplaced to change the Senate rules only for the benefit of the economy when the warning lights on our democracy are flashing at the same time. I happen to believe that our democracy is at least as important as the economy. Ours is a great nation, built upon both free enterprise and the free exercise of basic democratic rights. You cannot have good capitalism without freedom. Each is strengthened by the other. And together they make for a nation that is both prosperous and free, a nation where everybody can breathe and every child has a chance to live up to her highest potential. And so I stand here because of my children, my two precious children, and I think every day about what kind of country I want them to grow up in. I stand here today because we're in a place, and we're dealing with the consequence of misaligned values and misplaced priorities. And that is, for me, a serious problem because I lead Ebenezer Baptist Church, where John Lewis worshiped and where Dr. King preached. And I asked myself all weekend as I wrestled with how I would vote, I asked myself, what would Dr. King do? And I thought this week about Dr. King's speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. No, not the 1963 I Have a Dream speech, but the one he gave the first time he spoke in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 1957, where he addressed what he called, quote, all types of conniving methods that were getting in the way of the free exercise of the constitutional right to vote. His rallying cry that day in 1957 was, "Give us the ballot." And so, Madam President, in light of the conniving methods of voter suppression we have seen enacted into law since the January 6th attack on the Capitol, I come to the floor today to share with the people of Georgia and the American people the message that I shared with my colleagues over the weekend and earlier today during our caucus meeting. I said to my Democratic colleagues over the last several days, number one, unfortunately, the vast majority of our Republican friends have made it clear that they have no intention of trying to work with us to address voter suppression or to protect voting rights. They have embodied by their actions the sentiments of conservative strategist Paul Weyrich, who dared say in 1981, quote, "I don't want everybody to vote." That's what he said. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, he went on to say, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. Second thing I said to my Democratic colleagues today is that while we cannot let our Republican friends off the hook for not being equitable governing partners, if we are serious about protecting the right to vote that's under assault right now, here is the truth. It will fall to Democrats to do it. And if Democrats alone must raise the debt ceiling, then Democrats alone must raise and repair the ceiling of our democracy. How do we in good conscience justify doing one and not the other? Some of my Democratic colleagues are saying, but what about bipartisanship? Isn't that important? I say, of course it is. But here's the thing we must remember. Slavery was bipartisan. Jim Crow segregation was bipartisan. The refusal of women's suffrage was bipartisan. The denial of the basic dignity of members of the LGBTQ community has long been bipartisan. The 3/5 compromise was the creation of a putative national unity at the expense of black people's basic humanity. So when colleagues in this chamber talk to me about bipartisanship, which I believe in, I just have to ask, at whose expense? Who is being asked to foot the bill for this bipartisanship? And is liberty itself the cost? I submit that that's a price too high and a bridge too far. And so I struggled this weekend. I talked to folk I believe in. Among them, I spoke with Reverend Ambassador Andrew Young, who was with Dr. King until the very end about this vote. I talked to Ambassador Young and I asked him, what do you think? And he said, I try not to worry, but I'm worried about our country. And then this 89-year-old battle-worn soldier in the nonviolent army of the Lord drew silent on the phone. And then he said to me, tell your colleagues that among your constituents are people who literally laid their lives on the line for the basic right to vote. They lost friends. They lost so much. And so this is a real moral quandary for me, and it makes it difficult for me to cast this vote today. But after many conversations with colleagues, with Georgians, with experts who know the economy, with voting rights advocates and civil rights leaders, I will indeed vote today with anguish. I will vote to raise the debt ceiling. I'm voting yes because I'm thinking about the kids in the Caton Homes housing projects where I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I'm thinking about the hardworking families pushing to recover from the pressures of this pandemic, those on the margins and those who are least resilient, for whom a collapse of the economy would be catastrophic. And ironically, many of these are the same people who are also being targeted by the voter suppression efforts I mentioned earlier. I'm thinking of them and the people of Georgia as I cast my vote today to raise the debt ceiling. But I'm also thinking about what we need to do to keep our democracy and our economy strong today and for the next generation. Once we handle the debt ceiling, the Senate needs to make voting rights the very next issue we take up. We must do voting rights, and we must deal with this issue now. So let me be clear. I'm so proud of what we did with the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the major economic investments we're putting finishing touches on that will close the Medicaid coverage gap and deliver historic relief to Georgia farmers and expand broadband access and so much more. But Madam President, I have to tell you that the most important thing that we can do this Congress is to get voting rights done. Voting rights are preservative of all other rights. They lay the ground for all of the other debates. And so to my Democratic colleagues, I say, while it is deeply unfortunate, it is more than apparent that it has been left to us to handle alone the task of safeguarding our democracy. Sadly, many of our Republican friends have already cast their vote with
As the member
voter
designated.
suppression. And so the judgment of history is upon us. Future generations will ask, when the democracy was in a 911 state of emergency, what did you do to put the fire out? Did we rise to the moment, or did we hide behind procedural rules? I believe that we Democrats can figure out how to get this done, even if that requires a change in the rules. which we established just last week, that we can do when the issue is important enough? Well, the people of Georgia and across the country are saying that voting rights are important enough. I think that voting rights are important enough. And so we cannot delay. We must continue to urge the party of Lincoln not to give in to the very forces of voter suppression that Dr. King described in that 1957 speech while standing in the shadow of Lincoln. But even as we do that, we cannot wait. We cannot wait on them. With uncanny and eerie relevance, Dr. King's words summon us to this very moment. He said, "The hour is late. The clock of destiny is ticking out, and we must act now before it is too late." Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. I learned a long time ago never to want to give a speech after that. But I agree with what Senator Warnock said, and the Senate schedule kind of made me do this. So thank you, Madam President. I'm joined on the floor by Senator Warnock, who is one of the principals in our legislation, Senator Bennett, Senator Booker, and Senator Kaine, for their leadership and their work to deliver what is, pure and simple, the largest tax cut for working families ever. Tomorrow, for the 6th month in a row, July 15th, August 15th, September, October, November, tomorrow, 6th month in a row, Ohio parents, 92% of parents in Ohio with children under 18 will again see $250 or $300 in their bank accounts or in their mailbox per child. If they have 2 infant children, they will get $600. This is the most consequential thing we've done in decades to make people's hard work pay off. We know how hard parents work at their jobs, at raising kids. Any parent knows how much work it is to take care of children, especially young children, and it's only gotten harder over the last couple of years. So often that hard work doesn't pay off like it should. But we've seen what's happened, Madam President, over the past decades. Productivity's gone up, the stock market has soared, executive compensation is stratospheric, but wages have been flat. Workers' paychecks are finally, during this administration and this Senate, this Congress, finally, because of the work we're doing, worker paychecks are starting to go up. But after decades of stagnation, we have a long way to go. Meanwhile, parents know how expensive it is to raise kids: health care, school lunches, diapers, clothes, school supplies, braces, sports fees, camp fees. The list never seems to end. And of course, one of the biggest, if not the biggest expense for so many families is childcare. Parents feel like they're trapped. They can't keep up no matter how hard they work. They work more hours to provide for their family. They have to put that money right back into childcare. Sometimes the extra money in their paycheck doesn't even cover the extra daycare cost. It's why Senator Booker and Senator Kaine and Bennett and Warnock work so hard to enact the child tax credit. As I said, the largest, it's $3,000 tax cut. 92% of the families in my state with children get at least a $3,000 tax cut. The same in Virginia, the same in New Jersey, the same in Georgia. It's about finally making parents' hard work pay off so that they can keep up with the cost of raising a family. I was talking to Senator Kaine earlier. I know he's going to do some of the same things. Let me share a handful of really quick stories or comments that people have gone on our website and posted at the 15th of the month. Kristen from Columbus says, "I'm using this money to pay for daycare for 2 kids at $600 a week." Alex in Cleveland, "Every penny's going to daycare. 4 kids in daycare, $800 a week." Cece said her tax cut helps her pay for daycare. The same amount is my mortgage payment for 4 days a week. This is so helpful. Courtney from Southeast Ohio in Athens. CDC is slightly more than half the cost of part-time daycare tuition per month. Here in Athens, much appreciated help getting kiddos back into childcare, keeping me and my husband in the workplace. Brittany said daycare. Ellie said daycare. They also mean parents can afford to work and can afford to keep up with all the extra costs of raising kids. Katie in Akron helps to pay for school supplies. Caitlin, pay for preschool for my son. Lindsay, back to school clothes. Fern, preschool for both of them. The rest goes into a savings account for them. Jennifer put away for college tuition. Melissa, I use part of it to buy school uniform pieces for my 4-year-old. Maya, food and school supplies. These parents are all working hard to provide for their families and raise their kids. They're working a whole lot harder, Madam President, than the CEOs and the hedge fund managers who, it looks like under Build Back Better, may continue to get some of their tax cuts, their tax preference, if you will. It's a lot harder for these workers than the CEOs and the hedge fund managers and Swiss bank account holders that are always getting tax cuts from politicians in this building. We all remember what happened. Madam President, we can look down the hall. We've done that before. We've seen the lobbyists line up in front of Leader McConnell's office, line up in front of the politicians who always do their bidding, pass their tax cut for the wealthy and for corporations that outsource jobs. And you know what, Madam President? They told us 4 years ago when those tax cuts for the rich passed, they said, oh, it's going to trickle down and help everybody else. We'll hire more people. We'll raise wages. Of course, corporations didn't spend the money to raise wages. Of course, they didn't spend the money to lower prices, and then they blame everybody else for inflation. Of course they spent it, no surprise here, on stock buybacks, and they're still at it today. Now this year, without a single vote, not a single vote from Republicans in Congress, twice, every Democrat voting for it, a 51-50 vote, twice, we passed the child tax cut. It's pretty simple contrast. Whose side are you on? Do you want tax cuts for billionaires and corporations, or do you want tax cuts for working families? We want tax cuts for working families, Americans from all over the country, from all kinds of backgrounds. Let's deliver that for them. Let's keep the largest tax cut for working families ever so that parents can have that peace of mind, can relieve some of their anxiety they face every month to pay the rent and pay the bills. They can have the peace of mind that the child tax credit will keep delivering money in their pockets through the holidays this year, into next year, into next year's holiday. I yield the floor to Senator Booker.
I'm grateful, and it's frustrating, I know, to see such a incredible action taken where we have made a difference, where the child tax credit already has had a significant impact. The Columbia Center on Poverty found that the October payment of the expanded child tax credit helped ensure 3.6 million American children, 3.6 million American children are no longer living below the poverty line. And what does that mean? When a child is raised above the poverty line, their horizons are transformed. It actually saves an incredible amount of taxpayer dollars. For every dollar we spend bringing a child above the poverty line, we return $7 back to our economy, but there's deeper than that. There is a moral urgency. Children below the poverty line have so many more challenges. Their horizons are constrained. Their life outcomes are lessened. Above the poverty line, our children start to exhibit their genius. Children raised above the poverty line, they have higher lifetime earnings. They have lower medical costs. Children above the poverty line are less likely to go to the hospital, less likely to get in trouble with the police. Children above the poverty line have less inhibitions to their contributions to this country. I, too, like my dear friend, Senator Brown, have heard lots from people in my state about what this little bit of money in their bank accounts, how that little bit of investment makes a transformation in the lives of those families. Take Kelly in Pittman, New Jersey. She was forced to quit her job when her children's school and daycare closed due to the pandemic. She hasn't been able to return to work without reliable childcare, And the child tax credit is helping her family. It's helping to make up costs that were lost when she lost her income. It's helping her provide for her children. It's that little bit of help by returning those tax dollars. What she's paid in, she's getting more out now, and helping that family. Take Stacy in Kearney, New Jersey. The child tax credit payments were a, quote, lifeline and helped her and her husband keep their family afloat during this pandemic, during this crisis. She was indefinitely furloughed, and Stacy used those payments to send her two daughters back to preschool. Well, we know, the evidence is in, sending her two daughters back to preschool mean her children will do better in school, more likely to go to college, higher lifetime earnings, more success that inures to the benefit of us all as a society. Senator after senator on both sides of the aisle has thousands of these stories about what getting more of their hard-earned tax money back means. In a nation where we have seen the tax cuts of the last decade inure overwhelmingly to the richest of the rich, this was the first tax cut in my lifetime, the biggest of the tax cuts in my lifetime, that went overwhelmingly to middle-class families, working-class families, low-income families. And now it sits on a precipice. As many of you are aware, tomorrow is the last day that these payments are scheduled to go out to families like Kelly's and families like Stacy's and families of millions of families across this country. The changes we made to the child tax credit will expire. Struggling Americans, working Americans, middle-class Americans will not receive that payment in January unless this body acts. To prevent this from happening, to make sure that families continue to get more of their tax dollars back and have greater security, hope in challenging times, Congress can pass the Build Back Better Act, which includes the extension of the child tax credit payments, which are lowering costs for American middle class, working class, and low-income families. Now, I know there's concerns being raised about the Build Back Better legislation today, but I urge my colleagues to understand the high cost of inaction. First and foremost, letting this program will expire will raise costs from families at the very worst time. With the cost of gas and groceries going up, a tax increase, which is effectively what this would be, would mean millions of families in difficult times would have it be harder to make ends meet, to make those kitchen table economics work out. It'll add burdens to people at a time we should be lifting them, at a time that we should be providing relief. And again, it's not just working class families, middle class families. It's children living in that moral obscenity, that dark place within our society that's termed child poverty. The cost of inaction for all those children, the cost to our society overall of having children grow up to poverty is $1.1 trillion. $1.1 trillion. That's what poverty costs. But there is a moral cost that's greater than that. There is a moral obscenity that we are experiencing right now, a stain on the soul of our nation that we have, without this tax credit, the highest child poverty rates of all of our industrial peers. This is a moral moment in America. Our inaction will plunge our nation back with millions of families facing crisis. We have seen this body act in difficult times before. We've seen us invest in people. We've seen us stand up for children. My worry now is that tomorrow will be the last day unless we stand up and act. I join my colleagues, Senator Brown, Senator Bennett, join my colleagues, Senator Kaine, Senator Warnock, in calling us to meet this moment, to meet the moral urgency of now, and to please make sure that before this body leaves for the holidays, that those families who are in stress and economic strain, those families who are worrying about what will happen next month, that we show them that we care, we show them that we are fiscally prudent, and we make the best investment possible in America. It's not a stock or a bond. The best investment we can make is making sure the child tax credit continues, because it is an investment in our children. I yield the floor.
The senator from Virginia.
Madam President, thank you. I'm honored to join my colleagues today to speak about the child tax credit and do something similar to what they've done and just make it personal to families. Today or tomorrow, on the 15th of December, more than 930,000 Virginia families who together have 1.6 million kids will receive a child tax cut payment, $300 for a child under age 6, and $250 for each child between age 6 and 17. Those are big numbers. Those are big numbers. 1.6 million children, 930,000 families. And I'm here joining my colleagues to ask that this payment to parents, this parents' tax cut to help their children, is not the last, because unless we act, the 6th payment that will go out tomorrow will be the last. Now, the numbers are big, but sometimes the numbers can obscure, data and statistics can obscure what's really at stake. So just a week ago, I put out on my Senate webpage a question: what has this tax cut meant to your family? And in 1 week, we've received more than 200 responses, and I just want to share a few with you. Heather from Glen Allen is a full-time caretaker of her physically disabled daughter. Her daughter started having trouble with the stairs in her home, so they used the child tax cut payment to help them buy a new stair lift. So her daughter is still able to navigate their home. Heather wrote to me this, quote, "My family deeply appreciate the child tax credit because we routinely incur additional expenses while caring for a loved one with a disability. I take care of our daughter full time, which makes us a one-income household, so the tax credit makes a difference." Beatrice from Rockingham in the Shenandoah Valley works at Cooks Creek Presbyterian Church, and she sees how the child tax cuts have affected families they work with. One mother of 6, whose husband is incarcerated, relies on the payments to help with her child's medical expenses. Another couple that comes to this church, they're in their 60s. They're raising their great-nephew because his mother suffers from addiction. The tax cut is helping them cover necessities for this nephew. Lawanda, and I have a picture of Lawanda and her family. She's a single mom from South Boston, down on the North Carolina border. Lawanda sent me this picture and said, use this picture. She used the payments to help buy clothes and shoes for her children and to buy fresh fruit and vegetables, which they usually can't afford. I love this picture because this is a picture of people with smiles. These are resilient people who dream of a better future, and this child tax cut is helping them achieve it. Something as simple as being able to buy fresh vegetables rather than canned, or shoes. Something as simple as that is what this child tax cut is about. A Virginian from Lynchburg wrote that the tax cut has helped buy healthy food, clothing, and shoes, and then she said this: "Children grow so fast now and eat more, which causes many trips to the grocery store. We're senior citizen retired grandparents with legal guardianship of our granddaughter. With this being the last payment in December, which will be used partly for Christmas gifts for her, we will really have to stretch." Grandparents raising a granddaughter and finding in this tax cut the ability to afford Christmas gifts. Nicole from Leesburg is using the tax cut for therapy for her autistic son because insurance no longer covers it. Another picture, Sasha from Midlothian, which is right outside of Richmond. Sasha wrote to me and said this, and if you could, this is Sasha and her young one. "My husband and I both have secure jobs, but the cost of full-time infant care is very high. We spend 23% of our combined monthly income on daycare for one child, our one-year-old son. We also just paid off my student loans and are saving to buy our first house next year. The child tax credit has allowed us to save more money for that house and to pay off debts. We would like to grow our family, but worry about our financial burden. She also wrote, "Thank you for working so hard to pass the Build Back Better bill. I'm following it closely because it means so much to my family's future." From Alexandria, a constituent wrote, "Before the pandemic, the high price of childcare made it difficult to balance my family's budget. Each month, we went into debt a little bit more. My husband is a full-time student. I'm the sole breadwinner. The child tax credit helped me start to pay down debt, to begin an emergency fund, and to start a college fund for their son." A resident from Waynesboro, "I've benefited tremendously with the child tax credit. I'm a single parent in every aspect, raising 2 growing boys. It's helped me out with getting things they need for the school year. Also, I save some to be able to give them a good Christmas." Finally, LaQuanda from Roanoke, all she said was, "Please fight for us. Please fight for us." I could go on for a long time with these messages, as could my colleagues, but I'll stop there. I've read you stories from people who live in every region in Virginia. I want to thank my colleagues, Senators Bennett, Brown, Booker, Warnock, Cortez Masto, and others for leading the charge on getting this policy into the American Rescue Plan earlier this year. And I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues, because this thing passed by one vote in March. If any of us had been absent, if any of us had lost our last race, the American Rescue Plan would have failed, and none of these families would have received the support of the child tax credit. Well, we're going to have that opportunity again, and given the fact that one party has said they will not support this bill, it's on our shoulders. And these families who are struggling and working so hard and who have hopes as high as any of our hopes, they need us, as LaQuanda said, they need us to fight for them. Thank you to my colleagues for joining, Madam President. With that, I would yield the floor, but would defer to my colleague from Colorado.
Madam President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President. It is a wonderful moment to be here with my colleagues to acknowledge that in March, we passed the biggest reduction in poverty in generations in our country. And that was through the expansion of the child tax credit, which increased the credit, made it payable on a monthly basis, and for the first time in American history, made it fully refundable. So the millions of children in this country that were too poor to get the benefit of the credit because their families were too poor would get the benefit of that credit. And we needed to do it, Madam President. The United States, before we passed this, was 38th out of 41 industrialized countries in the world when it came to childhood poverty. The poorest generation in this country are our children, and I think what we said was there is no reason for us to accept those outcomes or those numbers as a permanent feature of our economy or our democracy. And in the end, this isn't about numbers. This is about children all over our country and the future of the United States of America. Childhood poverty, Madam President, costs this country $1 trillion a year. And one of the things we decided was maybe instead of paying for the effects of childhood poverty, we could actually begin to try to reduce the amount of childhood poverty that exists in our country the way other countries around the world have already done it. Nationally, the child tax credit, as I say, is cutting childhood poverty in half. It's reducing hunger among families by 1/4. Let that linger for a second, Madam President. When's the last time we were able to come to the floor of the Senate and say we've cut hunger in this country by 1/4? It's been generations since anybody's been able to say that on this floor. In Colorado, Madam President, 1 million kids and their families are benefiting from this credit. That's 90% of the kids in my state. It's 90% of the kids across the country. Parents in Colorado are getting an average of $240 a month to pay for groceries, to help with the rent, really importantly, to pay for a little extra child care so people can stay at work. And I know that because it's what parents have told me they're spending the money on. When we first passed this credit back in June, I think it was, that it first went into effect, July and August, people were getting ready to go back to school, and I had mom after mom after mom across the state tell me how important it was that they were able to buy school clothes for their kids without bankrupting their family for the first time. And you know, all of this is the reflection of an economy that for 50 years has worked extremely well for the top 10% of Americans and hasn't really worked for anybody else. And where, you know, the families that come to see me in my town hall say, Michael, we are working really hard, but no matter what we do, we can't afford some combination of housing, of health care, higher education, early childhood education, if we can even find early childhood education or daycare. We can't save. We feel like our families are going to live a more diminished life than we did, and that our kids will as well. And so I brought a few photos today to the floor to share some stories of Coloradans with all of you and my colleagues. This is April Pratt from El Paso County, and she lives there with her 3 daughters who are ages 8, 2.5, and 1.5. When April was pregnant with her youngest daughter, her husband tragically passed away. Now, she's the sole breadwinner for the family, and although she works full-time at the local school, there's not much left after her mortgage, diapers, and groceries for 3 young kids. Let me just say that again, works full-time. Works full-time. Before the child tax credit, April said she, quote, felt like I was having a lot of anxiety every month about whether I was going to be able to afford my bills. It was eating up a lot of my attention. And thanks to the child tax credit, April can afford the $1,200 a month for child care for her 2 youngest daughters so she can work. So she can work. She said, if I wasn't able to afford child care, I'd have to quit my job. Without the child tax credit, April said that she'd be, quote, forced to use my credit card to fill in the gaps, and that debt just accumulates and accumulates, and that becomes crippling, and my family wouldn't be able to get ahead. She said it was, quote, nice that our government is finally doing something to help working families and middle-class families. Finally, Madam President, after we have cut taxes for the wealthiest people in this country by more than $5 trillion since 2001, we finally have a tax cut for working families. We should be making it permanent, Madam President. This is Amberly Atencio, also from Colorado. She's here with her 3 girls that are ages 9, 12, and 14 when I got to this place. Mr. President, my daughters were 9, 7, and 4, so I have some appreciation for what she's got on her hands. They lived their entire life in Monte Vista, a small town in southwest Colorado in the San Luis Valley, and for the past 3 years, Amberly's been working full-time and studying, and last week she graduated with her 2nd associate's degree. She works for a local health insurance company, and before the child tax credit, her paycheck was the only source of income for her family. She said knowing that monthly support comes on the same day each month helps her pay the rent and buy food. She said, quote, I'm a single parent. This is like heaven to me. Knowing that I have that extra income to provide for my children, it has helped so much. Her daughters love sports, soccer, basketball, volleyball, and track. But between the shorts, knee pads, cleats, shin guards, and fees, it all adds up. And with the child tax credit, she's bought that equipment for her daughters so they can play sports with their friends, which means the world to them. I had a mom who told me that she had bought a bike for her son, and he was able to stay at school late to engage in after-school activities that he otherwise wouldn't have been able to do without that bike. And then finally, here's Aisha Bogart from Colorado Springs. Here's another mom from the Springs with her 3 daughters, age 12, 13, or her 3 kids, age 12, 13, and 23. And Aisha served for 16 years as a medic in the U.S. Army and U.S. Army Reserves while she was on active duty. She was injured during a training accident when her Humvee rolled over, and it left her with a traumatic brain injury. Now she's a single mom, supporting 3 kids all by herself. And before the child tax credit, she couldn't afford to buy new shoes for her kids. She said there were days when they didn't have shampoo at home, and her kids would get teased at school. And thanks to the child tax credit, she bought her kids a new pair of shoes. She bought them school supplies so they feel like they're on a level playing field with the other children in their school. She said the child tax credit has given her, quote, breathing room where there wasn't any before. I've heard stories like that all across the state of Colorado. This is an anecdotal reflection of it. It's not an anecdotal reflection of people not working hard. All these people are working hard. It's hard work just to raise a child, much less do the kind of jobs these folks are doing in an economy that's worked really well for the top 10%, as I said, but hasn't really worked for anybody else. And what has Washington's response been? Time and time and time again, to come here and cut taxes for the richest people in America and ignore the needs of working people. That's what we have done since 2001. $8 trillion of tax cuts, almost all of which have gone to the wealthiest people in this country. And now we've got a tax cut for working people in an economy that has not lifted them up the way it's lifted the people at the very top. We're saying we don't have to accept childhood poverty as a permanent feature of our economy or our democracy. We don't have to accept an economy where it only grows for the wealthiest Americans. We don't have to accept a Congress that is only paying attention to special interests and to the wealthiest Americans. We can build an economy that includes everybody. Then when it grows, everybody benefits from it, because the whole society benefits from that as well. Childhood poverty costs this country $1 trillion a year, Mr. President. We can't afford not to do this, which is why so many other countries in the world have done this. We can create opportunity for every American family and give every child the chance to contribute to this economy and to our society. And I believe that's fundamentally important to strengthening our democracy, making sure that we've got something we're proud of to turn over to the next generation of Americans. And that's why it's critical for us to extend this child tax credit, to not allow it to lapse at the end of the year, and in my mind, make it permanent. Mr. President, I'd argue we cannot afford not to. And with that, I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, like all Americans, Nevadans have been through a difficult 2 years. Our state was one of the hardest hit by the pandemic. Nevada relies on tourism and travel industries, and with the country in lockdown, a huge proportion of our families saw layoffs or furloughs. In fact, we had one of the highest unemployment rates in the country at one point in time, 30%. For those families, the middle-class tax cuts that we passed in the American Rescue Plan have been an incredible lifeline. Today, I am joining my colleagues to stand up for extending these tax cuts. It's so important that we get this done for people, not only in the Silver State, but across the country. In many cases, this money that Nevadans have earned really needs to go back into their pockets. We're talking about a tax cut that benefits the vast majorities of families in Nevada. In July of this year, because of the American Rescue Plan, as you've heard, the child tax credit increased to $300 per month for children under 6 years of age and $250 per month for children between 16 and 17 years of age. Working families with 2 young kids are receiving more than $500 a month back from the government to help them make ends meet. and it is making a tremendous difference. Over 594,000 children in Nevada and their families qualify for this money. I have heard story after story from people in the Silver State about the way the money is supporting their children. Some families are using the money for rent to make sure that their kids don't suffer from housing insecurity. Others use it for clothes for their children, or school books and other school supplies. Lori Munoz from Henderson, Nevada, told the Las Vegas Sun that she uses it for school lunches and other school expenses. She said, "You always think, oh, it's some extra money." Well, it's never extra money. Kids always need, there's always something that needs to be bought. And many families use it just to put food on the table. After those first payments were issued in July, the number of adults reporting that children in their households didn't have enough to eat fell by 1/3. And Jessie Cardinella from Reno told me that receiving the monthly payments let her stay afloat as a single mom on a teacher's salary and kept her from running up her credit card bills. She said, and I quote, "Thanks to the advanced child tax credit, I've mostly avoided this and been able to pay bills and even enjoy special outings with my children. The child tax credit encourages my family to make better choices in general, affording me assistance with quality childcare, options for healthier products and food, and providing the opportunity to participate in extracurricular activities that I believe are critical to a child's social and physical development." That was Jessie. And that's why it was so beneficial to her family and her children. Social interactions are so important for kids' mental health as well. And we know that throughout this pandemic. Triana James, a single mom in Las Vegas, used her extra funds to take her 2 sons to visit an uncle and an aunt in Northern California for the first time since the pandemic began. And because of underlying medical issues, they've had to be very careful about travel. But she said the child tax credit helped make it possible for them to spend time with family again at Thanksgiving. So these tax cuts have really been key for Nevada families. Now they're set to expire at the end of 2021, but the budget proposal that we're considering extends them for 1 more year. Mr. President, our hard-working families want us to keep this critical support going for them. This is not the time to make it harder for people to keep a roof over their heads or get their kids the essentials they need. So let's make sure Nevadans can keep that money that they've earned and extend these middle-class tax cuts to Nevadans and all families across the country. Let's support the working people. Let's support hard-working individuals every day and help them with their economic recovery. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Third reading. It's our new thing.
Mr. President,
Senator from Minnesota,
I ask for permission to vitiate the quorum.
without objection.
Mr. President, I have 5 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have been approved. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that all remaining time be yielded back.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will read the title of the joint resolution for the 3rd time.
SJ Res 33, joint resolution relating to increasing the debt limit.
The question occurs on passage of the joint resolution. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Thank you. Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rick, and I. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mrs. Capitone, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Yes. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Portman, no.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 49, and the joint resolution is passed.
Mr. President.
Zona.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session and consider the following nomination. Executive Calendar number 476, David A. Honey of Virginia to be Deputy Under Secretary of Defense. That the nomination be confirmed. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and that the Senate resumes legislative session.
Is there objection? The Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I object, and I submit a statement for the record.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering is a critical position that helps lead and manage our military science and technology work. This includes work on disruptive, cutting-edge technologies like quantum science, hypersonics, and artificial intelligence. Maintaining our competitive edge over China in these areas has been a focus of the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities, which I chair. And I know that all of us here understand how important it is. We worked on a bipartisan basis to include investments and policy changes for these priorities in the NDAA that we are hoping to pass this week. The Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering is tasked with carrying out many of these changes, and yet the nominee for this post has yet to be confirmed. Dr. David A. Honey is qualified. He brings decades of experience, including as an Air Force pilot, an intelligence officer, and in leadership roles at DARPA, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and within the intelligence community. Reflecting his qualifications, Dr. Honey's nomination has bipartisan support and was voice voted out of the Senate Armed Services Committee in October. At a time when our adversaries are investing heavily in an attempt to outpace the United States, we need all hands on deck and confirmed leadership in this post. So I'm very disappointed that we could not do that today. This is a matter of national security. I yield back the floor.